Last time, we saw how the Soviet Union's internal borders promoted division and conflict amongst the inhabitants of the South Caucasus, how this sparked warfare following the collapse of the Soviet state, the 25-year-long relative ceasefire with continued rivalry, the current conflict that began in September, leaving off on October 24th. With Azerbaijan in the midst of a flurry of successes following two failed Russian-led ceasefire agreements, and with the Americans having just brokered a ceasefire agreement. Now that American-led ceasefire also collapsed after just one night in effect, as both sides accused each other of breaking the ceasefire throughout the morning on October 26th. And in fact, by 1 p.m., Azerbaijani leader Aliyev confirmed an offensive by Azerbaijan was underway and announced further gains. The battle had been raging for Kashunik, or as the Azeris call it, Kubadlu, which Aliyev now claimed Azerbaijan was in control of. Later that day, Armenia admitted that Kashunik had been lost, and that its forces were now preparing to enact counterattacks. Kubadlu, a major target for Azerbaijan, was now back in its possession. As the Azeri advance continued, the tactics they were using became more clear. Azerbaijan was using drones deployed out in front of its advancing troops to take out Armenian positions. Thus, the Armenians oftentimes retreated prior to engagement with Azerbaijani ground forces. This lessened the number of direct firefights and made the capture of territory much easier. The Armenians, of course, were not able to fully strike back due to the fact that they were not fighting on their own territory, but also due to the fact that their technological capabilities were outmatched by Azerbaijan's, given Azerbaijan's purchase earlier in 2020 of billions of dollars worth of Turkish military equipment. For its part, Armenia imports lots of donated Russian equipment. However, Armenia's drone force is limited, and its capable air force was not really allowed to get involved due to the political considerations of potentially dragging Russia into the war. Because of the fact that a lot of Armenia's military equipment is gratis, Russia is able to exercise more influence over how it is used. Russia's interest is also not necessarily on supporting the present government in Armenia, which has exercised more of a pro-French, German, British policy over a pro-Russian policy which was prevalent among the previous Armenian governments. The current Armenian government, which came to power several years ago in a peaceful revolution, although was later confirmed by democratic vote, one of the few in Armenia's history, does not have the support of the pro-Russian money in Armenia, nor does it appear to have the confidence of the Russian military, which of course has a base in Armenia. These are just a few of the reasons why Armenia was unable to stop the continuing Azerbaijani attack. Throughout the war, as we saw in Part 1, Armenia has at times attempted to stop the hostilities by launching retaliatory attacks at Azerbaijani cities. These have at times come directly from Armenia, and at first, when a missile attack hit Barda on October 27th, killing 5 civilians, Azerbaijan accused Armenia of launching the attack from their territory. However, Artsakh later admitted its responsibility in the attack. It denied targeting civilian areas. Third-party sourcing, however, did later confirm, at least in principle. However, the very next day, a second missile attack also hit Barda, this time killing 21 civilians. The second attack included several ballistic missiles, and again, Artsakh didn't deny the attack but said it only had attacked military targets, though civilian losses were confirmed. However, if this was indeed an attempt by Armenia to force Azerbaijan to stop the offensive, that did not happen as Azerbaijan advanced in the southwest on October 29th. It set up border checkpoints along the Iranian border alongside the river Aras, while also advancing upland along the newly restored border with Armenia itself. This raised the risk for conflict with Armenia itself tremendously. However, Russia was urging caution, for if Azerbaijan attacked territory in Armenia proper, Russia was treaty-bound to get involved on the Armenian side. Something neither Russia nor Azerbaijan wanted, but would be unavoidable if something slipped and a mistake happened along the border. As the Azerbaijanis continued to advance to the north, the Lashin corridor, connecting Armenia to Stepanakert through Shushi and Lashin, came under threat. The Artsakh president conceded that advanced troops of the Azerbaijani army were just 5 kilometers, that's 3.1 miles, from Shushi, or as the Azerbaijanis call it, Shusha. Most of the 25,000 inhabitants of the town had already fled to Armenia, along with most of the rest of Artsakh's non-fighting population. Shushi, the second largest city in Artsakh, also forms an important wedge point on the Lashin corridor. The capture of the town would mean supplies to Stepanakert would effectively be shut off, with just one much less major road linking Stepanakert to Armenia. On October 30th, the Armenians delivered the promised counterattack on Kubadlu as they shelled the Azerbaijani forces in the town. The next day, continued shelling on both sides of the front line occurred, with retaliatory shelling across both sides in Tartar and Mardikert, as had been seen previously. Civilians had been evacuated from Mardikert, at least the non-fighting population, again with the rest of Artsakh, while much of the civilian population of Tartar remains and in fact suffered the shelling. But again, Armenia's options for response were limited, and some of these ballistic missile attacks and other shellings are purely due to a lack of other options to stem the tide. This is just one of the grim realities of war, and it was magnified intensively on November 1st, when virtually all of the repeatedly bombed areas in and around the contested zones faced heavy shelling. Kubadlu and Tartar by the Armenians, and Shushi, Stepanakert, and Mardikert by the Azerbaijanis. Azerbaijan also effectively declared its intentions, with Aliyev announcing that should talks continue to fail, Azerbaijan would fight all the way to the end, which can effectively be read to mean complete victory in the taking of Stepanakert. On the 2nd, Azerbaijan continued to shell Martuni, or Khojavend, and Shushi, while the next day it directly engaged Armenian and Artsakh tanks in battle. The Azeris claimed their air support helped take out numerous Armenian and Artsakh tanks and other armored personnel vehicles, while Azerbaijan's army then sent in its tanks to force the rest of the Armenian and Artsakh tanks to withdraw or be destroyed, both of which would occur. On the 4th, the Azerbaijanis took positions south of Shushi, while also threatening other positions along the Lashin corridor. As the advance occurred, due to the threat, Artsakh and Armenia's militaries closed the Lashin corridor, effectively cutting off one of the only routes to Stepanakert, certainly the most direct. On the 5th, Azerbaijan began shelling Lashin and continued shelling Martuni. Its forces, meanwhile, advanced to the north, and by the 6th were on the outskirts of Shushi. On November 7th, the Azerbaijanis attempted a second advance towards Martuni, or Khojavend. However, it was repelled. On the 8th, another Azerbaijani attack was repelled, this time an attempt at the final capture of Shushi. With that, the remaining population of Shushi, including the fighting men, which made up most of those who remained, were evacuated, and those who were supposed to remain on patrol reportedly evacuated anyway, following the drone attacks which accompanied the unsuccessful Azerbaijani advance. By the end of the day, Aliyev was claiming that Shusha was in Azerbaijani hands, and the next day Artsakh officials were forced to confirm the loss of Shushi and that Azerbaijani forces had taken the town, the second largest city in Artsakh. Also on the 9th, Azerbaijan tried again to take Martuni, or Khojavend, but was for a second time repelled in one of the few unsuccessful actions of the war by Azerbaijani forces. Later in the day, near the border between Armenia and the Azerbaijani exclave of Nakhchivan, a Russian gunship was downed by the Azerbaijani military in the exclave, killing 2 and injuring 1. Azerbaijan definitely did not want to bring Russia into the conflict and quickly apologized, admitting its mistake, but just demonstrating how easily one of these slip-ups can happen and potentially escalate a situation. With the capture of Shusha, the Lashin corridor was now cut off by Azerbaijani forces. Stepanakert was hamstrung, and Armenia, restricted by both its technological limitations and by its diplomatic position, was effectively at an internal crossroads. Meanwhile, Russia, which has always seen the Artsakh exclave as it was intended to be, an agent of Russian influence in Azerbaijan, definitely did not want the entire territory taken back by the Azeris, for risk of losing Azerbaijan completely to Turkey's sphere of influence. At the same time, Azerbaijan is a major weapons purchaser from Russia, and by no means wants to limit its options diplomatically by alienating Russia and being forced into a corner with Turkey. Because of this, it was advantageous or necessary, in some cases, for all sides to sign a peace deal. And the Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan, not only at war with Baku, but alienated diplomatically from his country's nominal backers in Moscow, had effectively no choice but to agree to a ceasefire with Putin and Aliyev. The ceasefire agreement was effectively, however, a surrender treaty by Armenia and Artsakh. Artsakh, unrecognized of course, and thus represented by Armenia, would be forced to cede large amounts of territory, that which had not originally been part of Nagorno-Karabakh under the Soviet borders, to Azerbaijan. And Armenian forces would have to completely evacuate from Artsakh, to be replaced in most cases by Russian forces. Azerbaijan, having captured most of its objectives and now able to return the districts of the former Azerbaijani SSR to the Azerbaijani state through peaceful means, Azerbaijan now had all the incentive to stop fighting and sign the deal. The deal was signed November 9th into the 10th, and by the 10th, Russian peacekeepers were scheduled to take over guarding of the Lachin corridor. The Russians will guard a road starting in Artsakh territory in Lachin, proceeding through Shushi, which is of course now in Azerbaijani hands, and ending up back in Artsakh in Stepanakert. The deal included handover dates for Artsakh to give back territory to Azerbaijan and Armenia's military to evacuate the territories. The first was supposed to be Karabakh, with a handover date of November 15th. This also included an exclave, part of the Soviet-era Karabakh district. Due to disorganization in the reeling Armenian and Artsakh forces, Azerbaijan later granted an additional 10 days to complete this requirement, changing the handover date to November 25th. This emphasizes Azerbaijan's commitment to the deal, due mainly to the fact that Azerbaijan is effectively dictating terms to a defeated enemy. It has every incentive to get the agreement implemented and therefore secure its gains. By November 20th, the Agdam district is scheduled to be handed over to Azerbaijan. Now, Agdam itself is another one of the abandoned Azeri majority towns, which have effectively become ghost towns that Azerbaijan intends to restore, similar to Jabrail, which we discussed in the last episode. By December 1st, the Lachin district and the entire border with Armenia is to be handed over to Azerbaijan forces, thus fully restoring Azerbaijan's border with Armenia proper, the entire Azerbaijani border with Iran already having been restored earlier in the conflict. This agreement was viewed in Armenia as a total defeat. Pashinyan, already lacking support from the Russian-aligned interests in his country, now lost the support of his populace as well. Violent protests erupted in cities throughout Armenia, particularly in the capital Yerevan, where protesters seized the parliament building by smashing down a metal door. When the president of the parliament, Ararat Mirzoyan, attempted to escape from the building, protesters pulled him from his car and beat him. Initially, it appeared the speaker had been killed by the mob, although the Armenian government later denied it and said he was in the hospital with serious injuries in stable condition. However, no evidence of his condition one way or the other has emerged since this beating, mainly due to the continued internal strife, with Prime Minister Pashinyan having not appeared in public since the parliament riots and the Minister of Defense resigning 2 days after the deal. What happens to Armenia's internal situation remains to be seen. It also remains to be seen how much influence pro-Russian factions will have over the future course of the Armenian government, and whether this defeat could mean Armenia's passing back into the Russian sphere of influence more fully from its current position being torn between Russia and France. Meanwhile, the victory celebrations commenced in Baku and other cities in Azerbaijan, including those that had been attacked during the war. Azerbaijan was going to be allowed to keep all of the land it had gained, including Shushi. It had not painted itself into a corner with Turkey and maintained relations with Russia, while also securing a huge victory for the Aliyev regime. Meanwhile, it was initially speculated that the result was a loss for Russia, and in the days following the peace deal, some articles to the effect were in fact written by Russian sources. However, it's since become clear that this is not nearly as big a loss for Putin as it initially appeared. Because Armenian forces have to evacuate from Nagorno-Karabakh, Russian peacekeepers will secure much of the remaining line of contact between Azerbaijan and the remnant of the Republic of Artsakh. With Russian forces already deployed along the Lachin corridor, Russia also promised to facilitate a project to completely reposition the Lachin corridor to the west, avoiding the now Azerbaijani-held city of Shushi. In the meantime, the Russians would guard the multiple borders that had to be crossed on this route. Russia also agreed to facilitate another border crossing between Azerbaijan and its Nakhchivan exclave through the Zangezur Mountains in southern Armenia. Just like Lachin will be under Azerbaijani sovereignty, but with the corridor guarded by Russian troops, this corridor would remain under Armenian sovereignty, but also protected by Russian peacekeeping troops. These agreements give Russia a continued foothold in Azerbaijan, not only through its new presence in Stepanakert and Artsakh, or its guarding of the Lachin corridor, but also through economic cooperation with Azerbaijan and Armenia for that matter, on this proposed Zangezur corridor to Nakhchivan. Thus, Russia was able to keep Azerbaijan within its sphere of influence, while at the same time acknowledging that Azerbaijan does have a special relationship with Turkey. Another lasting impact is the aforementioned drone warfare by Azerbaijan, bombing artillery and tanks ahead of its forces and thus reducing the amount of times they needed to fight on the ground and hugely reducing Azerbaijani casualties, which were about 6 times less than Armenia and Artsakh. This strategy and style of combat was being watched closely all over the world by the world's most important militaries, and of course Russia, Turkey, and Iran all had direct observational experience studying these new developments firsthand. Meanwhile, the civilian loss of life is, of course, the roughest part of war. And in this case, due to the territorial and border changes involved, as we've said before on this channel, every time a border changes, that means displacement as well. So this war featured both civilian casualties and lots of civilian displacement. Nearly 200 civilians were killed combined, with more than 500 injured, and some 120 to 150,000 civilians displaced from both sides. In this war, mainly ethnic Armenians, with many thousands of Azerbaijanis who were forced to flee from their homes back in the 1990s war, only now returning to their hometowns for the very first time since that conflict. Certainly a large amount of the Armenians will not be able to return due to the reconquest of these territories. And as such, the two wars that have now ravaged this land in the last 30 years have had the immense and tragic effect of civilian displacement on both sides. Once again, it reminds anyone who lives in peace to be constantly thankful and to always be mindful of the realities of the world. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the rest of the videos on our channel. For now, I'm Alex. I'm out.